All right, welcome back for Program Design Part 1.1. This is where we get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of our modifiable variables. First one being exercise choice. So what exercise do I do today? What exercise do I do next? What exercise do I do tomorrow? Which ones am I going to perform? Because I just learned, and now it's rattling my brain, that exercises don't determine adaptations. It's how I apply them. So does it matter which exercise you choose? Yes, it does matter which exercise you choose because exercises do determine the adaptation location. So which muscles are gaining that stimulus to grow or to become stronger or to create power. The movement pattern that we're trying to perform, maybe it's within our sport, maybe it's to allow for improvements in other exercises. Its movement patterns matter based on the exercise. Also, the loading capabilities. If I'm trying to overload my individual as much as possible, I'm not going to use a dumbbell. I'm not going to use a kettlebell. I'll likely use a barbell because I'm able to load it to a greater level compared to those other implements. Velocity capabilities. Okay, we can move only as fast based on the load. So some exercises are more conducive to velocity, like throwing a medicine ball. It's more conducive to velocity. Um, it's very difficult to develop strength with the medicine ball, but it's very easy to develop velocity. Similarly, if we're using a dumbbell, it's very difficult to move a dumbbell very quickly as opposed to something like a kettlebell. It's a little bit easier to use that implement at a higher velocity. We also have to look at muscle contraction. Are we focusing on eccentric muscle actions, concentric muscle actions, isometric muscle actions? If I really want my athlete not to be sore, I'm going to focus more on concentric muscle actions. So performing like a clean pull without catching the barbell, just dropping it on the ground, I'm only performing concentric work, as opposed to if I do a clean and catch the barbell, I have some eccentric force that I have to absorb. I have to take that into account when I'm choosing my exercise because I need to know which muscle contraction types I need to develop. I need to look at the stretch shortening cycle. Am I going to use it or not use it? Does the exercise allow me to use it or does it not allow me to use the stretch shortening cycle? Say I'm doing a box jump. I'm doing a box jump from a counter movement position. I can drop down and jump up. I'm using the stretch shortening cycle. Now, if I sit myself down on a box and then I jump from that stopped position and try to jump as high as I can and jump on the box, I've just eliminated the stretch shortening cycle. A very similar exercise, I'm still jumping onto a box, but I've chosen a different one based on if I need the stretch shortening cycle or I need to develop capabilities outside of it. It depends. And we have to look at the range of motion available within the exercise and within the athlete. Some exercises allow more range of motion than others. Using a wide grip bench press compared to a closed grip bench press. Closed grip bench press has more range of motion at the tricep. Wide grip has more range of motion at the shoulder. It just depends on the exercise we choose. We can also look at the balance requirements of the exercise. An exercise that requires more balance will have less load capabilities. An exercise that requires less balance, so it's a more stable exercise, the more loading we can contribute to that exercise. Think of that as like a bilateral squat, so 2 feet are on the ground as opposed to a single leg squat. It's harder to stand on one leg. You can't load someone on one leg as much as you can on two. So it's going to depend on my exercise choice. I have to look at also the equipment availability. This comes into the logistics of designing my training program. If I don't have a piece of equipment available to me, I can't choose the exercise that requires that piece of equipment. That's why I often utilize barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, medicine balls, and resistance bands, because you have more variety available to you as opposed to machine-based exercises where you're limited within the available exercise choice. So equipment availability, types of equipment, training space. If you're training 8 athletes and you only have 2 squat racks, can you program a lot of barbell rack-based work? Not very much, because you don't have the space available to you for the number of athletes or the exercises you want to choose. And lastly, the needs of the athletes will dictate your exercise choice. If my athlete needs to develop lower body strength, I'm going to use exercises that recruit more of the lower extremity musculature. It would make no sense for me to only develop upper extremity musculature when the needs of the athlete is lower extremity strength. Okay, so now let's get a little bit further into this. So we know that there are many different factors that determine my exercise choice. Now, what exercises can I choose? Okay, I like to kind of block out my exercise choice into 6 kind of buckets. I have lower extremity based exercise. I have upper extremity based exercise, auxiliary exercise, trunk exercise, weightlifting, so Olympic weightlifting exercise, and plyometric exercise. Okay, these are my 6 kind of buckets of training, and they all are a little bit more conducive to different training styles and different methods. So I'll start out first with our lower and upper extremity exercise choice. Okay, these are multi-joint exercises based on primal movement patterns, basic movement patterns, foundational movement patterns, and we get more variety on top of them based on the exercise choice and implement, but they're all based around a foundational movement. The first one is the squat or the hinge. This is where the pelvis moves in the x-axis, so we're doing a sagittal plane movement where we are bilateral and we're going through hip flexion, hip extension, knee flexion, knee extension, ankle plantar flexion, ankle dorsiflexion. Okay. The next one is lunge. Lunge is when we have a disassociated leg position. So one leg is in front of the other and the pelvis is in the middle. So this could be something like a split squat, a lunge, a lateral lunge. These are reverse lunge, anything like that where we are kind of rotating the pelvis in the transverse plane in order to separate our legs. The last one from the lower extremity is step. This is when we are more unilaterally doing something like a step up, step down, side step, crossover step, where we have to perform hip extension and balance on one leg while we're doing hip flexion with the other and continue to move in that position. So think of this as sprinting. We are using a step position. It's a unilateral, more unilateral movement. And we are tipping the pelvis in the frontal plane. So one side of the pelvis comes up with the leg as the other drops down with the other leg. So think of these as sagittal, transverse, and frontal plane pelvis movements with the lower extremity as our foundation. With the upper extremity, it becomes much more simple. We have vertical push and vertical pull. So this is when I am pushing an object away from my body, above my body, or pulling an object towards me, or pulling myself towards an object where the object is above and I'm pulling to it. Horizontal push, I'm pushing something away from me horizontally or away from the midsection of my body, or pulling something towards my body. So very simple upper extremity movements, lower extremity movements, and then I can use multiple different exercise variations within these kind of buckets within lower and upper extremity, or these primal movements. So something like a back squat, a front squat, a deadlift, a hex bar deadlift, all fall in this squat category. Split squat, front foot elevated split squat, walking lunges, Bulgarian split squats, all of these are lunge-based activities. Side step up, front step up, crossover step up, step down, sprint, sled push would all be falling into the step category of lower extremity. As well as for vertical push, I could say some kind of overhead press, vertical pull, some kind of pull-up, horizontal push, some kind of bench press, horizontal pull, some kind of rowing activity would be kind of falling into those buckets. These are my primary exercises within my choice. So these are really the ones that have the most load, the most velocity, the most capability. With the auxiliary category, I look at these as single joint isolation or extremity stabilization. So my elbow flexors, my elbow extensors, my bicep curls, my lateral raises, my hamstring curls, calf raises, those are all single joint isolation. And then extremity stabilization, all of my isometric work around hip stability, shoulder stability, grip work, where you're trying to squeeze as hard as you can and maintain that stability with the hand. Those would all fall into auxiliary. These are later on in the session, and they're more isolated and have single focus on one joint or on kind of individual isometric work. When it comes to the trunk, I look at these as our 3 movement patterns available at the trunk. We have flexion extension, we have rotation, and we have lateral flexion, or we have sagittal plane, transverse plane, frontal plane for our trunk motion. We also can resist all of these. We can resist flexion or anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-rotation, anti-lateral flexion. So we can cause the movement and we can resist the movement. We always start with resisting the movement. So I want my body to be able to resist trunk flexion, resist trunk extension, resist rotation, and resist lateral flexion first. So that gives me this foundation of stability within the trunk, and then I can start incorporating more movement because I'm able to control and resist the opposite. So here are my auxiliary and trunk-based exercises. And lastly, I have my weightlifting and plyometric exercises. These are more conducive to developing speed and power, less towards strength, endurance, fitness, things like that. Weightlifting exercises, we have snatch, clean, jerk, and their derivatives. So snatch is when the barbell goes from the ground to above your head in one movement. The clean is when the barbell goes from the ground to your shoulders in one movement. The jerk is when the barbell goes from the shoulders to above the head with the arm straight in one movement. Clean and jerk as a one movement together. The bar goes to the shoulders in one, over the head in a second movement. These are for the sport of Olympic weightlifting. Their derivatives, however, things like a power clean or a hang snatch or a power jerk, are all kind of bits and pieces of the snatch, clean, and jerk to focus more on very specific movement patterns. We'll get into more of that in our kind of lab discussions. With plyometric activities, we have the simplest, which are counter movement, where you aren't leaving the ground. So we're on the ground and we are just moving within our range of motion or dropping within our range of motion and reacting. Plyometric activities are there to stimulate stretch, shortening, cycle activity. Okay, so we're trying to have a rapid eccentric action and reverse it into a rapid concentric action. We'll get into that in our SAQP section or part 2 of program design. But with plyometric activities, we can use counter movement, which is the simplest, the least amount of eccentric loading. Drop jumps, where we're falling from a height and reversing into a jump. Rebounding jumps, where we are jumping ourselves and then jumping again from our landing. So things like skips, hops, things like that. And then bounding is when we are alternating our legs. These are more unilateral rebounding jumps. So think of these as kind of moving up in level, moving up in intensity of the eccentric action and then the reversal. So these are our basic bins, or 6 bins of exercise choice, and then the basics around the foundational movements within weightlifting and plyometric, as well as auxiliary and trunk and lower and upper extremity. We can go through more of the details a little bit later when we're creating our exercise bank. Right, so we've gone through choice, now let's go through order. So what should I do first? So I'm thinking of all of my exercises I can do. What do I want to do first? The first thing you should do is what matters the most. So if that's skill, that's technique, that's speed, whatever matters most, do it first, because that is what matters. Whatever stimulus you give to the body first, you will have the most adaptation to. The next is the most highest risk. Okay, if something is a high risk activity, so maybe it is your actual sport is a higher risk, maybe you should do sport practice before your training. Whatever is very high risk, if there's a risk for injury, do it first. And then whatever's most neurologically fatiguing, we want to do that first. So things that are skill, speed, and power, remember those adaptations that are neurological based, speed, power, strength, in that order, skill, speed, power, strength. Those are the most neurologically fatiguing. We want to do those first. Those are often also the higher risk and what matter most for our athletes. So it really all falls together. Do the fast stuff first, do the slow stuff later. Okay, so our general rules are whatever's complex, do that first. Simple stuff, do it later within the session. Next, what's the highest percent RM, or what's the heaviest to what's the lightest? What's the fastest to the slowest? the most unstable or unsafe to the most stable and safe, whatever's the primary goal to whatever the secondary goals are, and strength, power, and speed exercises before conditioning and hypertrophy exercise. Okay, so whatever your training session looks like, it should have these basic rules followed. Okay, so you should have more unstable, more complex, high speed, heavy, primary, strength, power, speed exercise training stimuli before your simple one. So you want to do your pull-ups before your bicep curls. Okay, you want to do your bounds before your squats. You want to do your bounds before your lunges. You want to do your split squats before you do your seated hamstring curls, things like that, things that are unstable to stable. Primary goal, what matters most to your secondary goal. So maybe it's speed and then strength. So speed comes first, strength comes later. This is our basic exercise order within a training session. Okay, so within a session, first thing you should do, skill-based activity. Okay, that is the most neurologically fatiguing, and we want to be the freshest when we're engaging in this activity. The next is speed. Similarly, we want to be as fresh as possible to move as fast as possible. If you're fatigued, you will slow down. If you slow down, that is not improving your speed capabilities. Similarly with power, then strength, hypertrophy, anaerobic capacities, and aerobic capacities last. Leave that for a second. Does this look familiar? Have we seen this before? Yep, it's the adaptations we care about. And we care about skill, speed, power, strength, hypertrophy, anaerobic capacity, and aerobic capacity. So within a session, we want to follow this order. If we don't have any skill activities, then move to the next one. If we don't have any speed activities, move to the next one. Oh, we have a power activity. We're going to train power using this exercise. Okay. Are we going to train strength? Yes or no? If yes, which exercises are we going to use to develop strength? Hypertrophy, we're not training any hypertrophy today. We're not training any anaerobic capacity. Oh, we're going to train some lactate threshold. That's going to be last. And it will go in that order. Okay, these are general rules. General rules. Okay, so don't think that this has to be followed every single time you make a training session. Okay, if my lactate threshold is what is most important for my sport, I'm probably going to do that lactate threshold session first. Okay, if my anaerobic capacity is what matters most, I'm probably going to do that first, and then I'm going to do my strength work later. It's not going to be perfect for those, but it will achieve my first mission, which is develop my individual goal or my general goal, my primary goal. Okay. Only break those rules if you're going after a specific goal. This is for safety as well as for effectiveness of each training stimulus. If we do a bunch of strength work, it's not going to inhibit our hypertrophy work. If we do a bunch of hypertrophy work, it will inhibit my speed work. If I do some long duration aerobic work and then I try to do something as fast as possible, it's going to limit my speed capabilities. So this is really to allow us to optimize each one by having the next not impede on the first. Okay, so they're general rules. If you break them, have a really good reason. All right, I'll see you in our next section.